The telegram arrives in Berlin on the evening of July 13th, 1870. Otto von Bismarck sits at his dining table with two men whose company he values above all others in the Prussian government. To his right, War Minister Albrecht von Roon, a soldier's soldier who has spent years rebuilding the Prussian army into the most formidable fighting force in Europe. To his left, Helmuth von Moltke, Chief of the General Staff, the silent strategist whose railway timetables and mobilization plans have been tested in 2 wars and found perfect. The 3 men have gathered for dinner at Bismarck's residence, but the mood is dark, almost funereal. They have been discussing the Spanish succession crisis, and all 3 believe that the moment for war with France has passed, that the opportunity has slipped through their fingers like sand. So Bismarck has spent the better part of 4 years maneuvering Prussia into position for this confrontation. The war with Austria in 1866 established Prussian dominance in northern Germany, but left the southern states independent, resistant to unification, clinging to their particularism and their distrust of Protestant Prussia. Only a war with France, Bismarck knows, will overcome that resistance. Only shared struggle against the traditional enemy will create the emotional unity necessary to complete German unification. And France, wounded in pride by Prussia's sudden emergence as a great power, humiliated by its irrelevance during the Austrian War, has been looking for an excuse to fight, to restore French prestige through military victory. The problem is finding the right trigger, the incident that will make France declare war while leaving Prussia, appearing as the innocent victim of French aggression. The Spanish succession crisis seemed perfect. When Queen Isabella of Spain was overthrown in September 1868, the Spanish government began searching for a new monarch. After several candidates declined or proved unsuitable, the Spanish turned to Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a distant relative of the Prussian king and a Catholic, which made him theoretically acceptable to Spain's deeply religious population. Leopold himself had little enthusiasm for the position. The Spanish throne sat precariously atop a volatile political situation, and the prospect of ruling a country he barely knew held limited appeal. His father, Prince Karl Anton, was similarly reluctant. Only Bismarck's persistent encouragement, his arguments about dynastic duty and Prussian interests, finally convinced the family to accept. The French reaction exceeded even Bismarck's hopes. Napoleon III, Emperor of France, saw the Hohenzollern candidacy as an existential threat. A Hohenzollern prince in Prussia to the east, another Hohenzollern prince in Spain to the south. France surrounded by members of the same dynasty, the strategic nightmare that had haunted French planners for centuries suddenly becoming real. The French press exploded in nationalist fury. Foreign Minister Agénor de Gramont, a hawk who had never hidden his antipathy toward Prussia, delivered a speech to the French legislature that was barely short of a declaration of war. France, he announced, I would know how to fulfill its duty without hesitation and without weakness. The implicit threat could not have been clearer. If Leopold ascended the Spanish throne, there would be war. For Bismarck, everything was proceeding according to plan. The French were working themselves into a rage. Public opinion in both countries was becoming inflamed. The crisis was escalating toward the confrontation he sought. Then, on July 12th, everything collapsed. Prince Karl Anton, Leopold's father, acting without consulting Bismarck or King Wilhelm, announced that his son was withdrawing the candidacy. The telegram reached Paris before it reached Berlin. The French had won a diplomatic victory without firing a shot. In the French Chamber of Deputies there was celebration. Adolphe Thiers, the elder statesman who had warned against war, rose to congratulate the government on its peaceful triumph. The crisis was over. The war that Bismarck had been engineering for years had evaporated before his eyes, but Gramont and his government, intoxicated by their success, made the fatal error of overreaching. Victory was not enough. They wanted guarantees. They wanted assurances. They wanted Prussia humiliated. On July 13th, Gramont sent instructions to Count Vincent Benedetti, the French ambassador to Prussia. Benedetti was to seek an audience with King Wilhelm, who was taking the waters at the spa town of Bad Ems, and demand a formal guarantee that the Hohenzollern candidacy would never be renewed. More than that, Wilhelm should send a letter of apology to Emperor Napoleon for having allowed the matter to proceed as far as it had. So these demands went beyond normal diplomatic practice. They treated Prussia not as an equal power, but as a subordinate state that needed to be brought to heel. Wilhelm, 73 years old, conservative, punctilious about matters of honor and protocol, was taking his morning constitutional along the promenade at Ems when Benedetti approached him. The king had been in a good mood. The crisis seemed resolved. His vacation could continue undisturbed. The unpleasant business of the Spanish throne was behind them. Now here was the French ambassador, pressing forward with what Wilhelm would later describe as importunate insistence, demanding that the king commit himself never to approve any renewal of the Hohenzollern candidacy, demanding what amounted to a permanent surrender of Prussian sovereignty in matters of dynastic succession. Wilhelm's response was courteous but firm. He had already given his approval for the withdrawal of Leopold's candidacy. What more did France want? One does not make commitments in perpetuity about hypothetical future events. The king's tone remained polite, but his refusal was absolute. Benedetti persisted, following Wilhelm along the park path, repeating his government's demands with increasing urgency. Finally, Wilhelm brought the interview to a close. He told Benedetti that he had nothing more to communicate on the matter. He instructed his aide-de-camp to inform the ambassador that the king would not receive him again, that any further communication should go through official diplomatic channels in Berlin. It was a polite dismissal, nothing more. Wilhelm had not insulted the ambassador, had not made any inflammatory statements. He had simply refused to make concessions that he viewed as incompatible with Prussian dignity. Later that afternoon, Heinrich Abeken, a senior official in the Prussian Foreign Office who was accompanying the king at Ems, composed a telegram to Bismarck in Berlin reporting what had transpired. The telegram was long, detailed, filled with the kind of diplomatic circumlocution that softens the edges of international confrontation. His Majesty writes to me, Abeken began, that Count Benedetti intercepted him on the promenade in order to demand from him, finally in a very importunate manner, that he should authorize him to telegraph at once that he bound himself for all future time never again to give his consent if the Hohenzollerns should renew their candidacy. The king refused, Abeken reported, at last somewhat sternly, as it is neither right nor possible to undertake engagements of this kind forever. Wilhelm told Benedetti that he had received no news from Spain, and since the ambassador was better informed about Paris and Madrid than he was, the French could clearly see that the Prussian government had no hand in the matter. The telegram concluded with Wilhelm's decision not to receive the ambassador again and his authorization for Bismarck to make the content of the telegram public if he saw fit. The telegram reaches Berlin at 6:09 in the evening. An aide delivers it to Bismarck at his dinner table. The Chancellor reads it aloud to Roon and Moltke, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. When he finishes, there is silence. Moltke, usually so controlled, lets his disappointment show. He had been certain that war was coming. He had his mobilization plans ready, had his army waiting. Now it appears they will not be needed. Roon shares the sentiment. 4 years of rebuilding the military, 4 years of preparation, and the French have been allowed to claim victory through peaceful diplomacy. Bismarck himself feels something close to despair. Without this war, German unification will stall. The southern states will remain independent. The work of a decade will be incomplete. His enemies in the Prussian court, those who opposed his aggressive policies, will point to this outcome as vindication. Perhaps Bismarck thinks he should resign. Perhaps his time has passed. Then something shifts in his mind. He reads the telegram again, more slowly this time, and he sees not failure, but opportunity. The telegram is polite, yes, but buried within its diplomatic verbiage is the substance of a confrontation. The French made excessive demands. The king refused. The ambassador was not received again. The facts are there. What is missing is the tone, the emotional charge that will transform a diplomatic incident into a casus belli. Bismarck takes out his pen. He does not add anything to the telegram. He does not fabricate any statements or invent any insults. What he does is more subtle and infinitely more effective. He strips away the diplomatic padding, removes all the courtesies and qualifications, condenses the account until nothing remains but the stark confrontation. His edited version reads, "After the news of the renunciation of the hereditary Prince of Hohenzollern had been officially communicated to the imperial government of France by the royal government of Spain, the French ambassador at Ems further demanded of His Majesty the King that he would authorize him to telegraph to Paris that His Majesty the King bound himself for all future time never again to give his consent if the Hohenzollerns should renew their candidacy." His Majesty the King thereupon decided not to receive the French ambassador again and sent to tell him through the aide-de-camp on duty that His Majesty had nothing further to communicate to the ambassador. What Bismarck has done is remove context while preserving fact. The original telegram made clear that the French demands were excessive, that Wilhelm's refusal was measured and reasonable, that the dismissal of the ambassador was a normal end to a completed negotiation. Bismarck's version makes it sound as though both parties insulted each other, as though Benedetti was arrogant in his demands and Wilhelm was curt in his rejection. The tone is completely different. The original telegram reads like a fragment of an ongoing negotiation. The edited version reads like a door being slammed shut. Bismarck finishes writing and looks up at his companions. His mood has completely transformed. The depression of minutes earlier has been replaced by something approaching exhilaration. He reads the edited version aloud. When he finishes, Moltke, who rarely displays emotion, slaps his hand on his chest and declares that if he may lead the German armies in such a war, then the devil can fetch his old carcass afterward. The words are theatrical, unlike the reserved strategist, but they express what all three men are feeling. The war they thought lost is suddenly possible again. Roon has tears in his eyes. He speaks of God not allowing Prussia to perish in disgrace. These are men who have spent their lives in service to the Prussian state, who believe in its destiny, who see this moment as the culmination of everything they have worked toward. Bismarck explains his reasoning with the cold clarity that has made him the most feared diplomat in Europe. The edited telegram, he tells his companions, contains no alteration in or addition to the original. Every fact it reports is accurate, but the form makes all the difference. A Becken's version would be regarded as a fragment of a negotiation still pending, to be continued at Berlin. This version appears decisive, final. When he releases it to the press and telegraphs it to all Prussian embassies, it will be known in Paris by midnight and in Berlin before noon tomorrow. It will have the effect, Bismarck predicts with satisfaction, of a red rag on the Gallic bull. The French, already aroused by weeks of nationalist fervor, will interpret the telegram as a deliberate insult to their ambassador and their emperor. The Prussian public, reading that their king was subjected to importunate demands and responded with justified firmness, will rally behind their monarch. Both nations will believe their honor has been offended. Both will demand satisfaction. The telegram is released to the press that evening. By the next morning, July 14th, Bastille Day, it appears in newspapers across Europe. In Paris, the reaction is explosive. The Ems dispatch, as it will come to be known, is read as confirmation of everything the war party has been arguing. Prussia is arrogant, aggressive, contemptuous of French power and French dignity. The edited telegram appears to show that Wilhelm insulted Benedetti, that Prussia seeks to humiliate France. Crowds gather in the streets chanting for war. The Marseillaise echoes through Paris. Young men march past the Tuileries Palace singing patriotic songs, waving flags, demanding that Napoleon lead them to victory against the Prussian menace. In Berlin, the mirror image plays out. The telegram is read as evidence of French presumption and unreasonable demands. The Prussian public rallies around their king, outraged that France would dare to make such requirements of a sovereign monarch. The fact that Wilhelm handled the situation with dignity only inflames public opinion further. If the French think they can bully Prussia, they will learn otherwise. The newspapers print inflammatory editorials. Beer halls fill with men volunteering for military service. The careful neutrality that had characterized public opinion about the Spanish succession evaporates in a wave of nationalist fervor. Across southern Germany, in Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, the states that have resisted Prussian dominance, that have maintained their independence even after the North German Confederation was formed, the reaction is equally decisive. These states signed secret military treaties with Prussia after the Austrian War, but they have been reluctant partners, jealous of their sovereignty, suspicious of Prussian intentions. Now, reading about French demands and Prussian firmness, seeing that France appears ready to attack Prussia, the southern states activate their treaty obligations. This is no longer a Prussian matter. This is a German matter. France threatens all German states, and the southern kingdoms will not stand aside while their northern brothers face French aggression. This is exactly what Bismarck calculated. He has transformed a diplomatic incident into a national crisis, and he has done it by changing not the facts, but the presentation of those facts. The power of words, the power of tone, the power of selective editing has accomplished what months of negotiation and maneuvering could not achieve. Germany is united in its outrage. France is committed to war, and Prussia appears to be the victim, the nation forced to defend itself against French aggression. In the French Chamber of Deputies, the debate over war is fierce but brief. Adolphe Thiers, white-haired and prophetic, rises to warn his colleagues that they are making a catastrophic mistake. The French army is not ready for war with Prussia. The mobilization system is antiquated. The command structure is confused. The allies that France counts on, Austria and Italy, will not materialize. To declare war now is to court disaster, but Thiers is shouted down. The chamber is filled with younger deputies who remember only French military glory, who know nothing of the changes that have transformed warfare since the Napoleonic era, who believe that French élan will overcome Prussian discipline. The debate becomes a patriotic rally. To oppose war is to be branded a coward, a traitor, someone who does not understand French honor. Napoleon III sits in the Tuileries Palace, suffering from kidney stones that cause him excruciating pain, and contemplates the decision before him. He is 52 years old, but looks decades older, his health deteriorating, his political position increasingly precarious. The liberal reforms he granted in recent years have not satisfied his critics, but have weakened his own authority. The plebiscite of May 8th gave his new constitution massive approval, 7 million votes in favor, but everyone knows that rural France voted for him while urban France voted against. Paris, the heart of the nation, the crucible of revolution, is turning against the empire. His regime needs a victory to survive. His wife, Empress Eugénie, has been quoted saying that if there is no war, her son will never be emperor. The dynasty requires military glory to secure its future. The military advisors surrounding Napoleon assure him that France can win. War Minister Edmond Leboeuf famously declares that the French army is ready, completely ready, that they could march to Berlin if necessary. The generals point to France's larger population, its military tradition, its superior artillery, the chassepot rifle that outranges the Prussian needle gun. They minimize the significance of Prussia's victories over Denmark and Austria, dismissing those conflicts as minor affairs against inferior opponents. France has not lost a major war since Waterloo 55 years earlier. Against Prussia, they assure the emperor, French arms will prevail. What these advisors do not tell Napoleon, what perhaps they do not fully understand themselves, is that the Prussian army has been transformed into something unprecedented in European military history. Moltke has created not just an army but a military system, a machine that converts industrial capacity and organizational precision into battlefield dominance. The Prussian railway network allows for the movement of entire corps in days rather than weeks. The telegraph system provides real-time communication between headquarters and field commanders. The universal conscription system, refined and perfected over decades, can mobilize hundreds of thousands of trained reservists within days of the order being given. The General Staff, that unique Prussian institution, has spent years studying every possible scenario, planning every movement, calculating logistics down to the number of railway cars needed to move a division from Berlin to the French border. The French military, by contrast, remains essentially Napoleonic in its organization and thinking. Regiments are scattered across France and North Africa. The mobilization system requires soldiers to report to their home depots before being assigned to field units, a process that takes weeks and creates massive confusion. There is no general staff in the Prussian sense, no systematic planning, no comprehensive preparation for the contingencies of modern war. French generals still think in terms of individual battlefield brilliance, of the decisive cavalry charge, of soldiers winning through courage and elan, rather than through superior organization and firepower. They are preparing to fight the wars of the past, yet not the war that is about to engulf them. On July 19th, 6 days after the Ems dispatch was published, France declares war on Prussia. The declaration is formal, delivered by the French chargé d'affaires at the Prussian Foreign Office in Berlin. The stated cause is Prussia's insult to French honor and its aggressive behavior regarding the Spanish succession. The real cause, though unacknowledged, is France's need to reassert its dominance in Europe before Prussian power grows too strong to challenge. Napoleon and his government believe they are beginning a limited war that will restore the balance of power and secure French leadership of the continent. They do not yet understand that they are beginning the war that will destroy the Second Empire, that will create a unified German state, that will shift the center of European power from Paris to Berlin. In the weeks that follow, the consequences of Bismarck's manipulation become devastatingly clear. The French army mobilizes slowly, chaotically. Units arrive at the border without supplies, without proper organization, without clear orders. The French battle plan, such as it is, calls for an invasion of southern Germany to separate the southern states from Prussia. But the southern states have already mobilized under their treaty obligations, and their armies are moving north to join the Prussian forces. The German armies, larger than anticipated, better organized than anyone expected, cross the Rhine and drive deep into France. The battles that follow demonstrate the revolution in military affairs that the French failed to recognize. At Wissembourg, at Spicheren, at Froschwiller, German artillery pounds French positions from positions beyond the range of French guns. The Prussian needle gun, dismissed by French planners as inferior to the chassepot, proves devastating when wielded by soldiers trained in fire and movement tactics rather than massed formations. The German railway system allows reinforcements to arrive precisely when needed, turning local French numerical superiority into German dominance. French commanders fighting independently without coordination are defeated in detail by German forces that operate as part of a coherent strategic plan. By early August, less than 3 weeks after the war began, Marshal Achille Bazaine has been forced to retreat into the fortress city of Metz with 170,000 men. Napoleon himself, attempting to relieve Metz with the army of Chalon, is intercepted at Sedan on the Belgian border. On September 1st, the German armies surround Sedan and methodically destroy the French force. Napoleon, watching from a hillside as his army disintegrates under German artillery fire, orders a white flag raised. He surrenders himself and 83,000 soldiers to King Wilhelm. The Emperor of France, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, ends his reign as a prisoner of war. The news reaches Paris on September 3rd. The city explodes in fury not at Germany but at Napoleon, the empire that survived revolution, that weathered political crisis, that endured military setbacks in Mexico and Italy, collapses in the face of this catastrophic defeat. On September 4th, the Chamber of Deputies deposes Napoleon and declares the Third Republic. The empire created by Napoleon's coup 20 years earlier dies without ceremony, without resistance, swept away by the military disaster it created. But the war does not end. The new Republican government, led by men who despise the empire but love France, vows to continue the fight. Paris prepares for siege. The German armies, having destroyed the professional French military in 6 weeks, now face the prospect of urban warfare against a city of 2 million people. The siege lasts 4 months, from September 1870 to January 1871. Paris suffers terribly. Food runs short. The population eats horses, then rats, then the animals in the zoo. The cold winter brings additional misery. German shells fall sporadically on the city, more for psychological effect than military necessity. The Parisians endure with a mixture of defiance and despair, knowing that relief is unlikely but refusing to surrender. Outside Paris, at Versailles, the German armies wait. Wilhelm establishes his headquarters in the palace of Louis XIV, that monument to French glory that once hosted the Sun King's celebrations of victories over German lands. The choice of location is deliberate, symbolic. In the Hall of Mirrors, where French kings once received the homage of European nobility, German princes gather to proclaim the establishment of the German Empire. On January 18, 1871, Wilhelm is proclaimed German Emperor in a ceremony designed to humiliate France and elevate Germany. The German unification that Bismarck has worked toward for a decade is accomplished in the palace that represents everything France once was and will never be again. 10 days later, Paris surrenders. The armistice terms are harsh. France must cede Alsace and most of Lorraine to Germany. France must pay an indemnity of 5 billion francs, an enormous sum that will take years to raise. German troops will occupy northern France until the indemnity is paid. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine particularly burns in French consciousness. These are not distant colonies but integral parts of France, regions that have been French for centuries. Their annexation creates a wound that will not heal. a source of French resentment that will poison Franco-German relations for decades. That will help drive Europe toward the even more catastrophic War of 1914. For Bismarck, standing in the Hall of Mirrors on that January day, the moment represents vindication of everything he has believed about power and politics. He has achieved German unification not through democratic revolution or popular sovereignty, but through calculated manipulation and military force. He has provoked a war that Prussia appeared to be defending itself against, has turned French aggression into German unity, has used the techniques of realpolitik to reshape the map of Europe. The telegram he edited on that July evening, those careful deletions that changed tone without changing fact, triggered the sequence of events that led to this moment. But there is a darker legacy to Bismarck's manipulation, though it will take decades to fully manifest. The Ems dispatch teaches a lesson that future leaders will remember too well, that war can be manufactured through careful manipulation of public opinion, that incidents can be engineered to provide justification for predetermined objectives, that the appearance of victimhood can mask aggressive intent. The technique will be imitated, refined, employed by later statesmen who lack Bismarck's skill but share his willingness to use deception as a tool of policy. The manipulation that seemed so clever in July 1870 will cast a long shadow over European diplomacy. The Franco-Prussian War also demonstrates the terrible efficiency of modern military organization applied to the purposes of destruction. The wars that Bismarck fought to unify Germany, the Danish War, the Austrian War, the French War, were each swift and decisive, limited in scope and duration. They created the illusion that war between great powers could remain controllable, that conflicts could be initiated and concluded according to political calculation. The experience of these wars will encourage European leaders to believe that future wars can be similarly managed, that military force can be applied with surgical precision to achieve specific political goals. The reality, demonstrated catastrophically in 1914, will be that industrial warfare between fully mobilized great powers produces not limited conflicts, but existential struggles that consume entire societies. Napoleon III, released from captivity after the fall of Paris, goes into exile in England. He dies in January 1873, broken in health and spirit. The emperor who lost an empire through a war he should never have fought. His legacy is ambiguous at best. He modernized France, rebuilt Paris, expanded the railway network, promoted industrial development. But he also led France into a disastrous war that ended French dominance in Europe and created the conditions for future conflict. History remembers him not for his domestic achievements, but for his catastrophic foreign policy failures. King Wilhelm becomes Emperor Wilhelm I of Germany, but the title sits uncomfortably on his shoulders. He never wanted to be emperor, preferred to remain King of Prussia, resented the federal compromises that Bismarck forced him to accept. The German Empire that Wilhelm reluctantly leads is a strange hybrid, federal in structure but dominated by Prussia, constitutional in form but authoritarian in substance. The tensions built into its founding will never be fully resolved and will contribute to its eventual collapse in 1918. The telegram that started it all, the Ems dispatch, in its edited form, becomes one of the most studied documents in diplomatic history. Generations of students will analyze Bismarck's technique, will marvel at his ability to transform routine diplomatic correspondence into an inflammatory manifesto. The manipulation will be both praised as genius and condemned as cynicism. What cannot be disputed is its effectiveness. With a few strokes of a pen, Bismarck changed the tone of a telegram and thereby changed the course of European history. The immediate consequences are clear enough. Germany is unified, France is defeated and humiliated. The balance of power in Europe has shifted decisively, but the longer-term consequences are more troubling. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine creates permanent French resentment that will fuel desires for revenge. The success of Prussian military organization encourages other nations to imitate Prussian methods, to build larger armies, to plan more extensively for future wars. The diplomatic system that maintained relative peace in Europe for decades after the Congress of Vienna begins to fracture under the weight of these changes. The arms race accelerates. International tensions multiply. The alliance systems that Bismarck carefully constructs to maintain German security will, after his departure, become rigid blocks that transform local conflicts into continental wars. On that July evening in 1870, sitting at his dining table with Roon and Moltke, Bismarck believed he was solving a problem, removing an obstacle to German unification, using the tools of statecraft to achieve a necessary objective. He could not foresee, could not imagine the chain of consequences that would flow from his manipulation. The telegram that he edited so carefully would start a war that would last 7 months, would kill tens of thousands of soldiers, would destroy the Second French Empire, would create the German Empire, and would set in motion forces that would lead 44 years later to a far more terrible conflict that would consume an entire generation. The manipulation was brilliant, the consequences were catastrophic, and the lesson learned was precisely the wrong one. That war could be engineered through clever manipulation, that public opinion could be aroused through careful editing of facts, that the appearance of innocence could mask aggressive intent. Future statesmen lacking Bismarck's genius but possessing his cynicism would attempt similar manipulations with far less skill and far worse outcomes. The telegram that started a war would become a template for manufacturing conflicts, and Europe would pay the price for that lesson in blood and treasure beyond anything Bismarck could have imagined on that summer evening when he took out his pen and began to edit.